You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
We started out with the craving and urging, which is to bring us into some mentalizing capacity around our thought processes. And now we're going to move a little bit outward into the bigger picture around this. Stress we define as everything that affects the balance of the system. Every sensing experiences changes the quality of the chemical soup that we live in. So the limbic system is in charge of dumping the chemicals in, and the liver and kidneys are in charge of pulling them out. And so there's a balance in the system that happens. Every sensing experience is created by the addition of these activating chemicals. So all things are stress. Then the question is, how do we manage the stress experience? We've been examining this thought processes. Something happens in the present moment, it exceeds the window of tolerance, then there's a event that needs to be regulated, and then the mind turns to the perceptual database for the system that's in place or the algorithm that's in place to regulate that kind of experience. If we tend to use substances or process addictions to regulate the present moment experience, the mind thinks of that process and then begins to plan around using it. Part of the component of each of these thought processes that we weren't exploring in the past session was the emotional component. So thoughts are made up of auditory, visual, and emotional experience, and the three of them come together and create this very believable experience that we're having. If one of them is absent, it doesn't tend to be as compelling. An auditory or visual thought without an emotional base to it is easy to let come and go, but as soon as it has that emotional component to it, it feels gripping. Emotion tends to play out on the surface of the body, face, front of the throat, front of the torso, inside of the arms, and inside of the thigh area of the legs. That's the arena of emotional reaction to the present moment. And what emotions really are is this preparation for an action that you might be taking next. So you evaluate what the present moment situation is. And then part of that, if we were to use the Buddhist frame, would be understanding what's happening, forming the intention for the action that you would be taking, and then taking the action. And we're at the forming the intention for the action. The body-mind prepares for that. So you've probably heard fight or flight. The full set is fight, flight, freeze, faint, fawn, and fornicate. A lot of people get a sexual energy when they're stressed because the thoughts around sex are regulating around the stress experience. If you're gonna,
George,
yeah,
apologies. Could you just repeat all the F's there? There was some F's I never heard before.
fight, flight. So fight, flight,
Right.
you run away.
Yep.
Freeze.
Freeze, I know.
Faint, you literally pass out. Fawn is bowing the head, lowering the eyes, and admitting that you are less powerful than the person. You see children do that quite a lot. They fawn the parents. And then a fornicate is that the erotic energy that comes up to replace the distress.
Thank you.
I've shifted them into all F's because I thought it was cute. Easier to remember. So if you're going to fawn, the blood rushes into the organs and pools, and you have high activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, which shuts everything down so that you can literally shrink. If you're going to fight, the sympathetic nervous system activates adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine, cortisol, endorphins, all are released in a big quantity so that you're ready to go. And it goes into the upper body because that's where you're going to fight. The body loses sensitivity so that you don't mind the pain experience of a fist hitting something. If you're going to run, all the blood rushes into the legs, and there's a huge adrenaline push and a huge endorphins push so that you can not feel the pain of your legs being shredded as you run through the grasses of the Serengeti, right? This is all evolutionary. We've developed in a way of being. We've also developed spirals in the brain, which are only associated with species that have complex social networks. So we're evolutionarily developed to be in social contact. And actually, I saw a study that showed a minimum of 2 hours of engagement is what the body really requires to be able to settle. So you can use that as a metric of how many days of the week do you spend at least 2 hours in the physical proximity to somebody else? In an affluent society like ours, it's easy to be totally socially isolated for days on end. Particularly if you've made the decision that I'm not having any relationships and I'm fine. But understand that the body is going to go into a pain response from not having the proximity. And you're going to be living with a level of pain that's much higher than people who do have that kind of proximity. Why they say married people live longer than single people. So what you're going to notice in your family system is that you have learned these strategies for regulating your emotions, and your family probably has centered around one or two emotions to be the primary vehicle for regulating. So if you were in my family, anger and sadness would have been the two main emotional regulators, with fear as a near third in terms of the emotion. So we call that the big three: anger, fear, sadness. Avoidant people oscillate between seduction and bullying as a way of getting what they want from them. And so they're really adept at generating anger in response to things. So that's why we center it on stress, anger, and depression. Fearful avoidant people, the main way that they emotionally regulate is by withdrawing into isolation. So if you've been around the 12-step world, they'll emphasize over and over again social isolation as a lead to relapse. So you have to be particularly attentive to that. Social isolation is probably the number one cause of lapse and relapsing, the pain of the disconnection from other people. When you attempt to succeed in relationships and you don't succeed, what follows that is a disappointment. One of the things that's happens in the attachment experience is that it's largely invisible, particularly if you're not sensitive to it in the beginning. And so you look around and you see other people who seem that you seem just as capable as being able to do it, being able to form functional relationships and be in them. And you don't seem to be able to do it. And it's baffling as to why you can't do it, and people that you seem either as good as or better than can. And so you try, and each time you try and it doesn't work out, there's an accumulation of disappointment. And at a certain point in your life, the disappointment will get so great that it isn't worth the risk of trying again, because you don't want to have the disappointment experience again. And so we give up. And for most people, that's somewhere in the mid to late 30s that people give up on it. Peter?
I think you may have just answered what my question was going to be, but it was sort of the relationship between sort of needing that co-regulation and isolating versus restricting yourself from all the perceived causes of stress. So if it feels like people are the source of my stress, I feel regulated by myself, but is that delusionary, or is that speaking to what you just described of like, it's too difficult. It feels like I feel better alone, but.
So here's the dilemma, using a Midwestern pronunciation of that word. You need to be able to make meaning, or the isolation becomes unbearable. So you reduce the stimulation that causes the distress, which also tends to mean that you reduce the risk of meaning gathering. And at a certain point, when the meaning gathering is so low, you become despairing at the difficulty of life. In order to really take the risks that you need to gather enough meaning that you don't mind the whole aging process, you have to take big risks. But big risks are accompanied by emotional dysregulation, which the reducing stimulus so you don't have emotional dysregulation doesn't work well with. Also, a lot of the times to take the risks to really get meaning means that you have to be in relationship in some way to other people who don't have the opportunity to take the risks. And so it's always this balance between reducing stimulus so I stay in the range of emotional tolerance and I don't have events that I need to regulate, and gathering meaning. That's the conundrum. If we could all just stay home in a nice place to live and not need anyone, actually, I think we would adapt to that pretty well. But it's the despair that comes from the lack of meaning of that. So then you're in the conundrum of disappointment on one side and despair on the other. What do you do? That's the pressure cooker. We aren't meant for that, really. It's totally pushing in the opposite direction of our biology. So there's a constant pressure not to do that. And, if you're on the dismissing side of things and you're suppressing awareness of the emotion, you don't notice the emotion, the unconscious emotional experience until it exceeds your pain tolerance, which is way too high. So by the time you're ready to respond to it, it's already terribly distressing, rather than at a lower level. And you may have let things go for way too long because of that. Not making sense? Go ahead.
Yes, but if that's the case, described very accurately, what would be, your first suggestion, or is it's all this attachment stuff, or what? If that's the case, what would be your first recommendation to get out of that?
To begin the examination of what is the primary exploration, and then to look for groups of people that are already interested in that. So that when you move into connection of the group, the activity or the exploration is the main focus and not the relational piece. One of the things that happens when you restrict your primary exploration is that you look for relationships to replace the meaning, or you look for things. Dismissing people look for things. Disorganized people look for relationships. It puts too much pressure initially on relationships where relationship skills aren't developed enough to really be able to function well. And so if you can shift the focus to the activity or the interest, then the relationships have a lot more space to begin to develop. Makes sense. And then to learn, really be mindful of developing these skills. Part of this is understanding what secure functioning relationships are like, as opposed to the modeling that you got in your family system. Avoidant, the relational skills you learned as an avoidant person are not to tell the truth about anything that has any real meaning to you, to avoid rejection, to avoid shaming. If that, not everybody has the shame piece, but a lot of people do have the shame piece. If you're organized and dismissing, and you are already able to explore enough to recognize that actually this is a better way to go, and then if you can pick people that are reliable, the early experiences of expressing yourself authentically will be greeted with a delight, and you'll see it and then be able to move in that direction. If you pick poorly in the beginning and you're, instead of being delighted and you're shamed, it reinforces that. Part of it is changing your mind about being willing to participate in collaborative relationships, which is something that you're going to have to learn to do. So in a collaborative relationship, you take care of somebody else in the way that they need to be taken care of, and you take on their whole care, and it's not transactional. It's not you do this for me and I'll do that for you. It's you take on their whole care. And then you pay attention to whether they take on your whole care. So you're taking care of them in the way that they need, and you're being taken care of in the way that you need. That requires a level of authenticity. You have to tell people what's actually meaningful to you. But then when you see how well that works and how it actually affords you the opportunity to get real meaning, for dismissing people, it shifts really quickly because you see that it's a better system than the one that you've been using when you see how it works. The conundrum of disorganized people is that they're on the other side of the trauma line. And the natural connectiveness to other people is the method of exploitation that you experience in childhood. Most people who are abused or exploited as children are seduced into the exploitation. And so that natural desire for closeness, for connectivity, is the means through which you were abused. And so what you experience when that natural desire for closeness arises is, I'm setting myself up to be abused. That's much harder to overcome, and you don't really have the mentalizing capacity at the beginning to tell the difference between somebody who will hurt you and somebody who won't hurt you. And it's so painful to be wrong, and so painful to be betrayed, and so disappointing that you can't tell the difference. That's really the thing that drives fearful avoidant people into social isolation. And so what I would suggest for disorganized people is that you begin to do the mentalizing work and the emotional regulation work first. You do the attachment work first before venturing out, because the setbacks that happen when you pick wrong in the beginning can really knock you out of the desire to do it for long periods of time. So you have to be careful. Is that making sense? Also, one of the key features of disorganized people is dissociation. And we say that you're disorganized because you use dissociation as the primary means of emotional regulation. And so you're coming and going from the relational negotiations, and you can retreat so far from what's happening that you don't really take in what agreements that you've made. or what agreements have been imposed on you. And then you don't act in good faith in the relationship from the other person's perspective, because they didn't notice that you dissociated out of the experience of what you were agreeing to. So that you have the experience of not agreeing to anything, and they have the experience of you agreeing to something, and both experiences are true and valid. Does that make sense? So there's a complexly disorganized people are it's sort of neck snapping swings of views and consciousness and emotional experience, both for yourself internally, which is just in a constant turmoil, and also the people trying to relate to you, because you're so unpredictable in terms of the way that you respond. Remember that secure mentalizing paradigm of you understand what you want to communicate, you know the person that you're communicating to, and you know how to language it so that they'll understand what you mean. Everybody uses their own definitions. And then you notice the reaction to what you've communicated so that you can modify your perspective of the situation that includes their point of view. If you're complexly disorganized, you can't, not only can you not do that because you don't have a consistent model of anybody, but nobody can really relate to you in a way that they can predict how you're going to react to what they say. And so it makes communication very difficult. And if you're dissociative and the expression causes a big emotional response, you don't take it in. So it doesn't modify your perspective of it. That's one of the reasons why some kind of assessment to determine what your attachment strategy is helpful, so that you can take a productive path in addressing this. So stress happens, and then the mind turns on the emotional regulation strategy that we're used to using. If you use anger or other strong emotion to regulate the present moment experience, and it goes on for too long, the chemical saturation in the soup of the brain becomes so rich, so undiluted, that you can reach saturation levels where you're in danger of physically damaging the neuroreceptors in the brain. And when that happens, the limbic system shuts down and you go into depression. So the limbic system is the thing that controls the chemical additions. When there's too much chemical in there, the limbic system shuts down and waits for the liver and kidneys to filter it out, that you're coming back into homeostasis, and then it turns back on. So what you'll notice is very typical of people with addiction is what we call in the West atypical cycling depression. So there's periods of depression that last about 2 hours or so. And then it takes 20 minutes, so up to a couple of hours to ramp up again to where you go back into that period of limbic shutdown. And when you get used to these cycles of depression, where we tend to be at risk for relapse is coming out of the depression. We realize that we're coming out of the depression and we don't want to go back into it, so we regulate it. So we need to pay attention to this. And this is really about thought processes, but also about developing alternative emotional regulation strategies. You don't have a choice about whether you regulate or not. You have some agency in what strategy you use to regulate. Remember, most of us are coming out of our family systems and using whatever system our family system used to regulate. We're not looking at the situation and saying, this is a difficult situation. I think the appropriate thing to do is to rage at everyone for half an hour until I'm so distressed that I go into depression. That seems like the best solution to this problem. what we do as children is watch our caregivers do that over and over again and take it on as the way that you respond to this kind of situation. Oh, I know the closest person to me, it seems like they're abandoning me, and I'm so frightened I'm going to rage at them so they never speak to me again because of the unspeakable things I've said to them. And then I go back to them and try and apologize, but the trust between us is broken. Those are the kinds of things that happen. And then gradually you move from less intimate to less intimate to less intimate relationship. Or you're in relationship with somebody who doesn't feel anything, so they don't respond to it, right? Two dismissing people together, neither one of them feels anything. You can rage all day at each other, and you'll notice the relationships that are built around that. And the pain tolerances are so high that if it isn't really extreme, you don't feel anything at all. So there's an advantage in the way that we couple. Anders?
Thanks. I was just curious, a while back, you kind of you summarized sort of what primary emotional regulation tools different attachment types used, and you covered avoidant and fearful avoidant. I was curious if you could briefly name those for preoccupied and complexly disorganized.
So when we look at the development of emotional regulation skills over the course of a life development in the early period, we're all starting out as autoregulators. And then if somebody comes reliably enough that we can shift and depend on them to regulate us, we become oriented toward external regulating. If that person comes reliably enough that we don't worry about whether the regulation is going to be available to us, then we begin to move into collaborative relationships where we are able to express what we want and what we need, and we have a reasonable expectation that our caregiver will attempt to meet those needs. That making sense. So a secure functioning relationship is where you don't worry about you're being able to get your needs met because they're reliably met in childhood. That's really what we're talking about. Preoccupied people get out of auto-regulating into external regulating, but they don't get beyond external regulating into collaborative co-regulating. So the preoccupied person is always looking for physical proximity to somebody who regulates their emotions. One of the things that happens to preoccupied people is that their autonomy and their exploration, both secondary and primary, is interfered with by their caregivers. Remember that, or maybe I haven't said, you have an 85% chance of having the same attachment strategy as the primary caregiver that you have. And you would have picked who your primary caregiver was out of the people that were available to you. That means if you have a preoccupied or fearfully preoccupied attachment strategy, the likelihood is that your caregiver also had that. So they're interfering with your exploration, because your exploration requires you to separate from them. And the only way that they can be regulated is in proximity to their regulator. And they tend to role reverse their children into being in the regulator role. So not their fault. That's their conditioning, like everyone else. They're conditioned to use an external regulator to regulate themselves. You, as the child, which they have to spend so much time with taking care of, become the regulator, which is a role reversing. So you have responsibility to take care of them. That makes you dependent on them to regulate you. Let me close this. So when that happens, internally, the experience is For secure people, my emotional experience is primary and the empathetic experience of other people is secondary. But in preoccupied people, it reverses, and the empathetic experience of other people becomes the primary experience. The common word for that in our culture now is empath. I become an empath, and your emotional experience becomes secondary. So you feel emotionally regulated when you're in proximity to the person that you're regulating. And when you are separated from them, you either feel depersonalized or dysregulated. So that's the drive for constant proximity. When you're with the other person, you feel regulated, and when you're not with them, you don't. Helplessly preoccupied or organized preoccupied people have an awareness of their own emotions and an awareness of the other person's emotions, and have some agency to regulate their own emotions. So you could turn your attention inward to your own emotional experience and be able to regulate it somewhat. And actually, that's the path back. You reorganize so that your emotions are the primary experience and the empathetic experience of someone else is the secondary experience. In fearfully or disorganized preoccupied people, what really happens is that you lose track of your own emotional experience, and your entire emotional experience is of the other. So you have to be in proximity to them or you feel completely disoriented. This works really well for a dismissing person, right? The dismissing person doesn't feel their own emotions, so they don't attend to them. But if they hook up with a preoccupied person who replaces their emotional experience as their primary experience and do everything to regulate it, the dismissing person feels regulated. The preoccupied person gets no credit for this because the dismissing person doesn't know they're dysregulated or regulated from the care of the other person. They just take it for granted. But then when the dismissing person is regulated, the preoccupied person can hitch a ride on the dismissing person's exploration and find a vicarious sense of meaning, which replaces the desperation of not exploring and not finding meaning. That's why the second most common coupling is dismissing and preoccupied. There's a 1 + 1 = 1 in that system. Is that making sense? Now the dismissing people are thinking, oh my God, he blew my whole game.
I'm wondering if you have anything to speak to specifically in that with the role of like romantic obsession and kind of the way that I feel like in sex and love addiction, we have these people who live inside our heads often.
Right. So what you're regulating there is the lack of exploration. Each time the mind turns toward your own regulation and your own pursuit of meaning, it dysregulates you, and then you go into a self-generated, repetitive thought process that regulates that experience by making it unavailable to you. You become obsessional of the other person. That completely relieves you of the pressure to form your own exploration. The difficulty for preoccupied people in establishing a meaningful exploration is that you don't have any of the skills that you need to do that because you were prevented from learning them in childhood. So you know how a kid is running along and then they trip and they fall and they just face plant and then they immediately look around to their caregiver to know how to respond to the intense physical sensations of that. And if the caregiver says, you're all right, I see that it hurts, but it's not so bad, shake it off and keep exploring, you develop the resilience that you need to explore. And if you're a preoccupied kid in a preoccupied dynamic, you fall down, the caregiver rushes over and says, you can never do that again, it's too dangerous. And so you have all of those associations with the steps that develop into a meaningful exploration. And you have to disable those and then learn resilience so that you can explore. What happens to preoccupied people is they make one or two gestures toward exploration and it doesn't pay off, and so they retreat from it. Whereas a seasoned explorer knows almost all things don't lead anywhere. It's only the very rare ones that do, and really you got to keep looking for them. And when you find them, you really have to value them. That making sense. So each time you notice the mind is going out toward the other person, pull it back and sink it into your own emotions. That's the beginning. And learn to regulate your own emotions so you're not dependent on someone else to do it for you. Now, in collaborative relationships, what you do is you learn how to regulate all of these different circumstances from your experience of being regulated in all of those different circumstances. In a secure household, it's very reliable. The same thing happens over and over again, so you can recognize the association between this happens, this is the regulation strategy. The problem with preoccupied caregivers is that they're very chaotic and they don't tend to repeat the same thing over and over again. Preoccupied people don't monitor because there's no value in monitoring, because the approaches that the caregiver take are so chaotic. They don't do the same thing 3 times in a row so you can see a pattern. And so then you have to also begin to learn consistency in the attempts to get something to happen. Make sense? It's not impossible. That's what I'm reading from your face. Oh God, this seems just completely impossible. It's not. Children can learn this. You're an adult, you could learn this. It's just when you bounce, when you trip and face plant, you don't bounce in the same way that a child bounces because you're bigger. So it's a little bit more of that. James?
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm just mindful of the time as well. It was more a curiosity that's a little bit, I don't want to wander too far afield, and you're answering quite a few questions here.
Okay.
So feel free, of course, to, if you want to, I can bring it up at another time. But
I do.
Sorry?
I do, feel free.
Thank you. Good to know. I'm glad. I had just a curiosity of kind of about this group, and I don't know, I'm not speaking specifically to any of the groups that you're outlining in terms of the various like kind of emotional orientations that people have, but in general with this group and people who I think are susceptible to addiction, there's a component that I've noticed. There's a characteristic I've noticed that I noticed in this group, which is a tendency towards kind of intellectual thought, and and something that I find in this group, which is interesting to me, is that I feel so engaged, and I feel very stimulated and engaged, right? It's something that I often feel that I can lack when going out and exploring relationships, is that sense of mental stimulation, because it's not something that's so well encouraged in society, it's kind of like what you're saying about the thing with the professional golfer and teachers. We don't get everything right in society. The fact that we have people living in tents on the street, we don't get everything right, do we? And not to say that society should be some way, it just is. But, I just wonder if you have any comment on the tendency of people who seek intellectual stimulation, and, where to kind of seek that out, maybe.
If this group was what you mean by Mettagroup, I wouldn't say that we have a bias toward intellectualism here. It really is the balance between cognitive and affective that we're going for. And And I think one of the things that's engaging about this context is that a lot of people resonate with this puzzle piece to the experience of their life, whereas a lot of other things don't answer it so well. So it's surprising, and also there's a sense of relief that I have a frame now that I can make sense of these things that I've been puzzling over for so long and haven't been able to make progress with. And so there's an enthusiasm that comes with that, which I think is useful in as an energy source, but understand the balance between, you have to push yourself pretty hard to maintain that enthusiasm so you make progress fast enough. But you can't push yourself so hard that it makes life worse. So that's the balance point. You have to push yourself hard enough so that things change fast enough that it's worth the effort, but not so hard that you become even less functional than you might already be.
Thank you.
So that's what I think about that. But then what you're also talking about, which I think is really important, is that we create our expectation of what the world will be, and we create through limiting beliefs what we think is available to us. And you may be experiencing that process of creating realities where you don't engage where you want to go. And so you're finding that it's less stimulating. If you live in, we haven't talked about the non-mentalizing modes, but one of the non-mentalizing modes is called pretend mode, where you really monitor the way that you present yourself in the world in the way that you think other people will find acceptable. And in the process of doing that, you don't express your authentic needs. So often they're not met. Even if you're successful in expressing an inauthentic need and that need is met, it's still not the authentic need. And so you're still in a place of deprivation. And so you're constantly moving from deprivating reality to deprivating reality, and not understanding why that would be. Whereas that movement into the spontaneous, authentic expression of what's happening to you would lead to something more fulfilling, and may even with the same people be more fulfilling if you were able to do that. And yet the inhibition of the sadness and the inhibition of the shame and disappointment prevent you from doing it. So part of this is the scaffolding that's necessary to take those risks of authenticity.
Thank you.
How's that?
Thank you.
So organized people fear expressing themselves authentically because they're afraid that if they do so, they'll be abandoned. And if they had the shame experience in childhood, that they'll be shamed. Disorganized people feel that if they express themselves authentically, they'll be killed. Not kidding. Understand the difference between feeling abandoned and shamed and the intensity of that experience versus the experience of feeling that you're going to be killed, exploited and killed. So it's much more restrictive in the disorganized group, the willingness to take that risk, than it is in the organized group. Chuck?
Hi. So do you have delineations under disorganized? I heard you mentioned there's fearful avoidant, complexly disorganized,
And
you
fearfully
mentioned
preoccupied.
passive. Okay.
Huh?
And you mentioned something about passive earlier today.
Passive preoccupied is organized.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
You could be both disorganized and passively preoccupied. But organized people do better than disorganized people by a lot.
So fearful avoidant is part of disorganized?
It is.
Okay.
So disorganized, organized avoidant people suppress awareness of their emotions, and they suppress the attachment system. Fearfully avoidant people don't do that. They don't suppress the attachment system, and they don't suppress their emotional life. In fact, their emotional life is very chaotic. What they do is suppress the external expression of it. So it manifests quite differently. So a dismissing person feels cool, calm, and collected and idealizes everything. So it's going to be great. Everything is great. It's going to be the greatest it ever was. And the fearful avoidant person is completely invisible to most people because they make no outward expression of anything. It's like they get the invisibility cloak from Harry Potter and hide in the corner, and then they're angry that nobody notices them. That's the conundrum of the
I'm
fearful.
familiar. It's kind of like the duck paddling. You don't see the work. They're just sort of
Right.
gliding up the surface. Yeah.
Yeah, that's them.
Thanks.
Peter.
Just to go back, when you say like the threat of being annihilated or killed, and you say that it's literally, would that apply to like a child's perspective of like a larger domineering sort of rageaholic who, as an adult, you recognize like that wasn't actually, death probably wasn't realistic, but from the child's perspective, that fear, is that what you're speaking of? Or it's really like sadistic homes where like truly death is the consequence. Does that make sense?
It's the perception of it.
Okay, from the child's perspective, potentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that creates the expectation of annihilation. To me, means that the child abandons the integrity of their sense of self in response to the rage, and they fawn and become whatever the other person wants.
Could I interject and let me know if this aligns with your thinking, George?
Okay.
Also, that like it could be trauma that happens at an early enough developmental stage that abandonment by the caregiver would mean death because that child is not capable of surviving without the attachment to the caregiver.
That's true. There's a thing called anaclitic depression, which tends to happen in response to that. And that's a particular thing that happens to people. Once the self experience, the conscious self experience arises, it's more like what Peter is describing. But the analytic depression, what do you do when you need to get attention from your caregiver and you're an infant? The first thing you do, you look as cute as you possibly can. You smile and chirp and do all these different things. If nobody comes, there's a look of confusion. And if you want to see this, you can see it in children, like 2 or 3-year-old children. They'll put their arms up like this. They want to be picked up. And if nobody comes, they look confused and put their arms down. I had my arms up. Where was anybody who was supposed to come and pick me up? And then from the confusion comes a whimpering of pain that they're abandoned. Now, if you've ever been to a kid's birthday party or a gathering like that, and you'll have a ring of parents standing around talking to each other, and all of a sudden one will go, I hear that. They're hearing their child's whimper in the cacophony of kids' noises, and they rush off. They're rushing off because they know if they don't get there in time, that whimper is going to turn into an intermittent cry. The intermittent cry is going to turn into a continuous cry, and that continuous cry is going to turn into a tantrum. And if the kid gets into a tantrum, that means the limbic system has dumped everything, and it's going to take them 20 or 30 minutes for the liver and kidneys to filter the chemicals out. And they're going to have to take care of the kid for 20 or 30 minutes to get them to calm down, right? But if they can get at the whimper or at the intermittent cry, it'll take 2 minutes or 3 minutes, right? If nobody comes in tantrum mode, the child falls off a cliff into what's called anaclitic depression, and the whole system shuts down. And so if you have that, what you'll notice is there's an involuntary shutdown when the emotional distress level gets too high. And it's as if you're behind a wall and you can't get out of it. And that happens a few times in childhood, and it changes the whole physical structure of the brain in a way. And there's really no way out of it later in life. You just have to learn how to manage it better. So that's the extreme part of that child neglect, infant neglect that happens. It's not uncommon in the disorganized community for people to have that. That's why I'm talking about it. It's not even unusual in the disorganized community.
And I about to ask what you would say would be management strategies for that.
Yeah. It's completely heartbreaking. But that it's not unusual even in the disorganized community. So what we have to do in order to change the stress, anger, and depression cycle is evaluate the particular strategies that we use to regulate our emotions. And then we have to develop alternative methods to regulate our emotions so that we can swap those out. So intentionally beneficial strategies that we can then swap out the afflictive strategies for. One of the other things that we should pay attention to is understanding the 4 basic kinds of emotional experience that we need to have good clarity about so that we can really recognize what's happening in the moment so that we know what to do. The first is the reaction to the present moment, which plays on the surface. So face, front of the throat, front of the torso, inside of the arms, and inside of the thigh area of the legs. We're going to set up a Rizuku where the recordings from this will live. And in the Rizuku, we'll put up a supporting text tab that will have the Finnish study map of the patterns of emotional experience. One of the things about growing up in families that don't have good emotional clarity or use suppression as a way of regulating their emotions is we don't have good clarity around what emotional states that we're in. Often when parents are disorganized and they're expressing a mixture of emotions at the same time, we have trouble, say, telling the difference between fear and excitement, or we have trouble telling the difference between anger and sadness. So we want to develop really good clarity around the different emotional states that we have. Then we want to understand that we think thoughts that generate emotions that are regulating, and we have patterns of that. If something happens and the present moment gets too exciting, we're going to have a way of regulating intense excitement. If you grew up in my family, it's likely that you regulated intense excitement with anger. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what would happen. So then you have the experience of life of the positive things swinging into negative things if they get too intense. So you withdraw from intense and positive intense experiences because it always ends up going sideways. That makes sense. And so we really do need to examine that, and that's part of. Also in the Rizuku will be what we call always cool, always kind, which is 90 hours of guided meditations that take you through the mentalizing and emotional regulation stuff. There's 20 hours of basic meditation instruction. And then there's what we call the 84 meditations, which are about mentalizing and emotional regulation. And then there's the 56 meditations, which we call the divine abodes. We have two systems of regulating emotions, one for positive and one for negative. We want to reduce the afflictive negative emotion quality, but at the same time, you have to intentionally develop the capacity for positive experience. Positive experiences can exceed the window of tolerance, just like negative experiences can. And we really have to be clear about regulating positive experience with positive experience so that we don't deprive our lives of positive experience by always turning everything negative. That makes sense. Now, you may be thinking 90 hours of guided meditations. How long is this going to take? I want you to get a sense of the amount of effort you're going to have to put into pushing this along to get it to shift. You have a 70% chance of using the same attachment strategy throughout your life that you had at 10 months old. That's when we can test you. You have to push this in the right place. Archimedes, old Greek guy, said, give me a place to stand and I can move the earth, right? Give me a place to put my fulcrum and I can leverage the earth. You're going to have to leverage this in the right way to get it to shift. Otherwise, it's going to stay the same and you're going to have to put pressure on it. This is not to say it's impossible. This is to say it's totally doable if you do the right thing and you do it long enough. I just want you to bear that in mind. How long is long? If you do it at a normal pace, it takes 2 or 3 years. Is that too long? But some people are doing it at an accelerated pace, and maybe we'll set up an accelerated course to do it in a year. I got an email from one of my students a couple of days ago that said, there should be an advisory alert on your website that says, undertaking this is like taking on a part-time job. I don't want you to be disappointed if you don't do enough and it doesn't change, because it's resilient and you have to push hard. We have to learn to mentalize well enough to know what's going on, and then we have to learn emotional regulation strategies. And the 4 systems that we're regulating, we need clarity about, are the present moment experience, the self-generated emotional experience. When the emotional intensity of the present moment becomes so intense that it's going to threaten the physical stability of the system of the body-mind, it's dissociated and stored in the body for later processing. That we call that somaticized emotional experience in the West. So you may be familiar with that. What you notice as our emotional centers, they tend to be away from the surface of the body. They tend to be of a particular size and shape. They tend to be consistently in the same place. There's an energy quality to them. And then there's a release of emotion from them periodically. So the way the system is set up, and this is particularly true of children, something happens that exceeds the capacity of the child to feel that in the moment. It's stored for later processing, and then the sensitive enough caregiver attends to the child and allows them to express that emotional experience, and so it's released. So in secure functioning households, kids don't tend to have so much of this. But if you had a chaotic upbringing or neglecting upbringing, nobody attended to this. And so you tend to begin to store overwhelming experiences over and over. Now, the way that this process of storing happens is all of the what happens is stripped off, And it's simply the emotional meaning of the situation that's stored. So we can't really know what it is that's there. It's not like we can remember events that are happening. We just remember the affect of it, the feeling of it. And that we release in waves. It doesn't matter what the narrative is. We do live in a culture where we love our narratives and we have to assign one to everything. And so one of the harder parts of working with a somaticized emotion is not inventing narratives that explain the feeling of it. That it's not helpful in terms of the release of it. It doesn't matter whether you have them or not. So I find as a conservative energy person, not creating them is better because you don't use up the energy to create them, and then you don't get attached or identify with the content of the narrative. And then you release those over time. The fourth emotional experience that you really want to have clear awareness of is the empathetic emotional experience of other people. For dismissing people, this is particularly challenging because empathy is an emotional experience. And if you suppress awareness of your emotion, you also suppress awareness of your empathetic experience of others. So you'll notice that one of the chief complaints about dismissing people is they're unempathetic. When you repair your experience of emotion, the empathetic experience returns. And so then you have to develop clarity between this is my emotional state and that's your emotional state. It isn't that dismissing people don't feel, it's that they filter out a conscious experience of what they're feeling. And so part of the process of this is pulling out those filters that separate the unconscious from the conscious so that you have an awareness of what your emotions are moment by moment. One of the difficulties of this for dismissing people is once you pull the filters out, you're going to have these unnamed emotional states that arise in you, and then you're going to have to begin to figure out how to match them to what we generally think of as particular emotional experiences. There is not a universal emotional experience. There's the experiences that you have that are called such and such in your family system. Is that making sense? So the reason that some people have trouble telling the difference between sadness and anger is because that wasn't well defined in the family system that you grew up in. So as you begin to learn these emotional experiences that are entering consciousness, there's a few ways to do it. One is you listen to your intuition about it. One is that you associate those states with different representations in media. So you're reading a novel and you suddenly are overcome by a strong feeling state, and then it says in the novel that the character is overwhelmed by sadness, and then you begin to understand this is what sadness is called, this feeling. Remember that you know what your emotions are called because somebody told you what they were called, which meant somebody empathetically connected to you, understood what they were, and then told you what they were called in the mirroring process. So you're an infant, your caregiver attunes to you, they empathetically connect to you, they compare your feeling state to their own understanding of what emotional states are. They make that expression on their face, mirror it back to you, and then they tell you this is sadness, this is happiness, this is joy, this is anger. And then you associate that facial expression with that sensation in the body, and you understand that as the experience. Is that making sense? Dismissing people are neglected. Nobody mirrored back to them. Nobody told them anything, and that it became so painful they suppressed it. So they have no history of being able to do this. And so this is one of the big speed bumps in terms of recovering or earning security is being able to identify this. The experience of disorganized people is a little bit different than that. They don't suppress awareness of their emotions. They suppress the expression of them. And so they have an internal state that's very chaotic and very emotionally intense. and a very flat affect in terms of the expression of it. So they're very often left without the regulating help of somebody else. Is that making sense? So the main way that we're emotionally regulated by other people is an unconscious empathetic exchange with them. And we want to pay attention to who's a good regulator for us and who isn't a good regulator for us. But you attune to somebody, so you place your attention on them, they place their attention on you, and then you allow your empathetic experience of them to bloom in consciousness. They allow their empathetic experience of you to bloom in your consciousness. You bring your emotional regulation skills to their empathetic experience. They bring their emotional regulation skills to your empathetic experience. And as you're exchanging empathetic experiences, it becomes regulating, mutually regulating. Is that making sense? If somebody is so dysregulated that they can't regulate themselves, and you empathetically connect to them and you regulate their experience, and they also are taking in your regulated experience, that begins a process where they come back into emotional regulation. We call that co-regulating. Now, your conditioning and their conditioning need to intersect in order for that to happen. And there's not a whole lot you can do about that. Your conditioning and somebody else's conditioning is going to mesh easily, or it's going to conflict. And so what you're going to pay attention to is who do you mesh well with that also is regulating for you. And that's what we're really looking for. And that's the most useful in relationships, is to have somebody where hanging out with them for 20 or 30 minutes without even talking about anything particularly is regulating emotionally. So you could have no effect, doesn't have much effect on you. It's very regulating for you, or also dysregulating for you. All of those are available. Is that making sense? So that's what we're paying attention to. So in the stress, anger, and depression exploration, we want to understand the stressors and how we tend to react to them. And then we want to replace the afflictive strategy with a beneficial strategy. In the Metta-Vipassana approach that we use for this, we have the intentional development of positivity, which is the heart practice side, and we have the Vipassana side of exploring what these emotional structures are, which we use the noting feeling states technique for. So you have to do both. But for today's practice, we can do one or the other. Which would you rather? This always turns down to one vote democracy, but everybody in favor of the metta side, everyone in favor of the Vipassana side. That meaning we've all decided metta is the way to go.
I lost track of the difference.
So in the loving kindness practice, we're focusing on the development of intentional positive states. And in the noting feeling states technique, we're discerning what emotional state we're in moment by moment.
I vote the noting feeling state.
Okay, so here we are. This is Vipassana, this is metta. Do we have a third vote? The abstainers are winning.
Metta for me.
Metta? Anyone else? Metta. All right. It looks like Metta is sweeping the election with a turnout of less than 50%. So I'm going to teach what we call dry metta, which is a concentration-oriented metta, which is meant to develop the capacity to understand mind states or views, and to have some agency in generating mind states or views. This is a very important aspect of earning securities, so that in addition to recognizing what the view is, you can begin to recognize what your attachment state is so that you have the mentalizing capacity to understand what to do about it. I think that it's better if I take you through the meditation and then we have a period of questions after so that we don't spend time on hypothetical questions. Because it changes the way that we perceive reality, if we're not good at tracking views or mind states, we can slip into the idea that what we're experiencing is an accurate representation of what's happening. And then we can take actions based on that perception of it. And if our perception is wrong, we can create a lot of havoc in our worlds because of that. We don't really operate in the experience of what's happening. We operate in the experience of what's happening means to us. And so part of this is a shift out of this is what's happening. I know what's happening because I'm having this experience into this is what this means to me. What does it mean to you? So that you can enter into these collaborative dialogues with other people about what actually we are able to experience, because what's happening is not one of those things. That makes sense. You have the capacity to sense the object that will be sensed when there's contact. A consciousness of that sensing experience arises, which is unformed, unassigned. It's evaluated for urgency, and this is more of a body thing. If you touch a hot stove, your hand has already been removed from the stove by the time you're aware that there's a hot stove. That's that first part. And then you go into how the mind regulates the experience of burning your hand. Ow, I burned my hand, whatever it is that happens next, depending on your conditioning. Urgent things go to the head of the line and they always jump. Most things don't really ever get into consciousness. And then if there's time for pleasant experience, we have a pleasant experience. So we can get ourselves into these negative jags where there's no positive experience and everything looks bleak. It doesn't mean the positive experiences are there. It means it doesn't get into our meaning cycle. Then that undifferentiated, unfixated, undefined sensing experience is compared to the perceptual database. And if there's a meaning in the database that's close enough to what the experience of the present moment is, that whole thread of experience attaches to the present moment. And so some of these threads go all the way back into childhood. So the moment is filled with all of these different resonances of meaning. Sometimes it's a novel experience, and so we don't really know what it is. And then our imagination steps in and defines the meaning of it in the present moment. And those threads can be quite short, depending on what the experience is. If you're like me and you crave novel experiences, you like the newness of that defining of what the meaning is. Now, one of the things that can happen in childhood is that our capacity to imagine meaning for things gets pinched off. I like to say pinched. It gets restricted. If you're a child and over again, you're unable to get the things that really matter to you, one of the ways that we regulate the painfulness of that situation is we don't allow ourselves to imagine being able to have them. That's not for us. We can't do it. And it can get to the point where you're not even aware that that's what's happening. So in each moment, what opens up are all of the possibilities that you could choose. And the meaning that we assign values them in a hierarchy of choices. And then we tend to pick the ones that are on our list of preferences from that full range. But if you've restricted your imagination and you don't think that that's a possibility for yourself, often they don't even appear as a choice that's available to you. And if you get really confined, you pick over and over again the same choices. Even if they don't turn out well, you still pick them over and over again, because that's what you're allowing into consciousness. And so part of what this exercise is is to open up and really examine all of the possibilities that we could have and begin to choose in a virtuous, beneficial way, so that we get into a virtuous cycle rather than picking afflictive choices that put us into an afflictive cycle of things. In each moment, what opens up are all of the possibilities that you could choose from that are connected to this moment. This moment is connected into the past moment of choice. That's the process of karma, right? We make a choice which opens up a set of choices, and we choose from that set of choices which was dependent on the previous choice. And then the next choice we make is an array of possibilities that are dependent on the previous choice. And you can get into these virtuous cycles where the choices get better and better, and you can get into these afflictive cycles where they get less and less useful to us. So we want to pay attention to that. Over and over again in childhood, if you couldn't get the things that you wanted, you stop wanting them by suppressing the desire for them, not because they wouldn't still be of use to you. And so we need to begin to open that up. One of the conditions of addicts is a really crushingly low self-esteem, crushingly low value of the self. And this comes from that experience of over and over again, not being able to get what you needed, not being able to get what you wanted, not having the things that matter to you valued. And we need to begin to open up the imagination again around this, which is the central pathway of exploration. And we need to do a ton of the heart practices. We have this working model of self that each time it's activated, all of these little algorithms of experience activate and create the perception of self. When our early experiences and the subsequent experiences then are largely negative or restricting experiences, each time the sense of self arises, it's a largely negative experience. And we begin to develop an aversion to having this negative response over and over again to the conditions of the present moment, which is the root cause of this self-hatred, the root cause of this terrible, low self-valuing. And so what we need to do is lopside the working model of self so that each time the sense of self arises, it's largely a pleasant experience that we enjoy having, which then is the root cause of self-love to arise. Is everybody okay? We're just about out of time for today. So next time, we'll begin talking about persistent negative emotion, which is the somaticized emotional experience. Then we'll get into difficult interpersonal relationships and talk some more about how attachment conditioning creates the patterns in relationships that we experience, and do some more sitting practice. All right. Reassure me that you're all okay, and then we can go.
George.
Huh? Good. Thank you. And I will see you soon. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, George. It was very helpful.
Good.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Georgia. Thank you, everyone.